Jose, welcome.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Believe it or not, I just got a phone call from the Biden-Harris campaign asking for me to come canvass or go to one of their canvassing events. I,
Yeah,
that was a pretty funny coincidence. Yeah.
go do it. You should go do it. You should then just try and tell people to break away or have Kamala Harris declare the 25th Amendment.
Well, I
Uh,
know your views on Biden being too old to run, which I assume would align with the views
my
of
views?
the objective reality of
Yeah,
Biden being too old to run.
I think it's just reality, man. It's not about him being old. He has dementia.
Yeah, I mean, the debate was insane. I didn't actually watch it the first showing of when it was, actually being debated live, but I went back and watched it after people told me how bad it was, and I could not believe it. It's like sad. He looks defeated. He's like downtrodden, almost falling asleep.
Yeah, but even scarier than that is who's actually been running the country for the last few years. I mean, it's not him. So don't we have a right to know who's been actually making the decisions?
Who do you think is making the decisions?
Oh no, that's the thing. We should be figuring that out. Anyway,
No.
yeah. No, who do I think has been running the I don't know. That's the thing. We don't know. I mean, if the problem is everybody's lying about this thing. Everybody wants to talk about how bad the debate was, and it was terrible. I mean, of course,
Right.
but it's not anything we didn't know already. It just was fully on display. The question people should be asking themselves is like, what is the relationship of former presidents to the White House right now? To what extent are the daily duties of the president actually done by somebody else? Obviously, the president can't write all his speeches. He can't do everything. That's why he has a cabinet. But to what extent is the cabinet actually running things, Because when Bush was president, George W. Bush was president, you knew Dick Cheney was the one actually running the country. W didn't know anything
Right.
about how to run the country, but you knew Cheney was doing it. And you certainly know Kamala Harris isn't doing it because she's a fucking airhead. So, I mean,
I see. I see.
it's yeah. Anyway, it's so that this is actually what everyone should be asking themselves. There is no president right now. There is no presidency. So that everything is just like, should we replace Biden? Should we not? Is missing the point. So
I see. Jose, since you're on, I'm gonna let that roll. I'm gonna let that be the intro to this episode. But also kind of want to give you a proper introduction because you deserve
oh,
it.
sure.
Um, this is Jose Vega running for Congress in the Bronx, and I'm extremely excited to have him on because he's a man of ideas as well as someone running. He's a paradigm shifter. He's bringing attention to books by Lyndon LaRouche into the public attention and advocating for what might be called Hamiltonian economics. That to me is a very interesting paradigm shift away from conventional economic thinking. And Jose, would have gotten from watching you in other interviews of yours I've watched, like the one with Kim Iverson, is that you're a developmentalist. So you don't care if somebody considers themselves social democrat or conservative, if you believe that they're going to build infrastructure, that they have a vision for the future, and that they're tuned into sort of the needs of the physical economy, of actually building things. Would you agree with that characterization of your
You know,
beliefs?
I suppose, but I think people should just abandon their labels altogether
Well,
because the thing is, you have to look at your life in the context of the greater scheme of things. Whatever we do right now, okay, it only matters in the future. That's the only time it matters. It doesn't matter who we date, who we marry. It doesn't matter what we do, what we eat. A lot of the things that we do in our life genuinely don't matter. So what actually does matter is the stuff that we leave behind for the future. What is going to make the life of somebody born 100 years after you're dead better, and how does your life play a factor into ensuring that the perpetuity of development and perfection continues to grow and grow and grow. So, whoever calls themselves a libertarian or a social democrat, it genuinely does not matter because, what matters is how is this going to help humanity as a whole, to make sure that not only does the human species continue to thrive and survive, but actually develop and is better than your generation, and then that generation is better than the one that came before it, and so on and so forth. So yes.
Is that a theme of Lyndon LaRouche's book, The Next 50 Years? Because I started to study it to form some questions and to be a better conversationalist for this episode. I didn't read all the pages of that book yet, but I wonder, why would anyone not agree with that? Why would anyone not think that planning for the future and creating a better development for the future is the most important policy goal?
Why would people not agree with it? Because we've had an eroded understanding of what it means to be a human being. I mean, like that's just the truth of it. I mean, it took a long time for people to kind of understand what it means to be created in the image of God, and why the Renaissance was so important to mankind, and how it kind of took us out of the Dark Ages. The reason people don't agree with it today is because they have such a low view of themselves and what it means to be a human being, that they just say,
I see.
why should I care about development? That's the thing, right? People think their lives begin when they're born and end when they die, but they don't understand the idea of what it means to actually be immortal, which is not a physical idea that you're going to keep breathing forever. Of course not. You're going to die. But creating something that's going to last forever is a whole different idea, and that's where your immortality actually is. And if people understood that more, that their life is just a piece of this greater scheme, we're only here for what, 80, 90 years at best, and then maybe 100, 110 if you're like really lucky, but it's not, the quality of life is severely dropped, but and
It's
you
like
exist.
we're not just consumers, we're not just rational self-seekers, but building for the future is probably an urge that goes deeper than most people realize, because we're used to thinking about the paradigm of transactional human relationships, right? Like, what do I gain from putting this in? But there's a saying that reminds me of, where it goes that if someone can plant a tree for, plant seeds for the trees that they'll never see, then that truly is wisdom.
Yeah, that's about right. That's exactly what I think. That's exactly how I think society should be structured in. And I mean, I'm not saying people should then therefore sacrifice their entire lives to just making sure that the future is better. No, the point is for people to live more comfortably than you do these days, and to ensure that everyone has a higher standard of living so that people can develop their creative potential. I mean, you can't make a great work of art or create some new machine tool principle if you're hungry, or if you're living in squalor, or if you have to worry about whether or not you're going to be able to pay the health care bill or something. No, it's all about maximizing human creative potential. That's what life is about. That's the great scheme. That's the whole enchilada of what it means to be a human being. It's just,
Right.
limitless constant development. And you look at human history as a whole. I mean, what, there's about 500,000 years of human history. Some people estimate even 1 million to 2 million years of human history. And you look at it, this huge thing. Most of human development in terms of the physical machine tools have happened in like the last 150 years.
Hmm.
But flight gets developed in the early 1900s, and then we're building war bombers. And then in 1968, we're sending people up to space and then to the moon. I mean, it's great, right? The development is actually happening quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker, and it's all limitless too.
Hmm.
So, and that means there will always be development. There's always something new to develop and create, and we just need to continue to tapping into that.
One of the quotes from the book, The Next 50 Years, I found that I wanted to ask you about, has to do with why cultures actually choose to develop, or versus, as he puts it, why they choose to stagnate. He writes in very raw terms, for compared to most other social scientists, that there's a celebration of mediocrity and a fear to change for the better that ultimately leads to cultural suicide. He says the descent is the ferment of genius and foolishness alike, but remains nonetheless the breeding place where something could emerge, by aid of which a people liberates itself from the deadly grip of misguided customs. And he wrote that this systemic purging of systemic voices is the usual characteristic of that failure to overcome a systemic crisis whereby a once powerful nation leads itself into self-inflicted doom. I mixed up a bit of the words of the order of that quote, but that's essentially what he wrote. I want to know, like, does this theme of the fear of innovation, or maybe like the fear of what could be, play a role in today's politics the way you see it? Because that struck me as something um, that is a very, very core truth that he's writing about, and compared to more technical explanations of why, politics will fail, why governments fail. This is like connecting what human nature is, what human nature wants to preserve, actually ends up making it go backwards. It makes us stagnate instead. I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Um, well, I don't even know where to begin with that. You just have to look at, I mean, one of the things that's taken up in the book and that one, and So You Wish to Learn Economics, is that you can measure a culture's development and a society's development by population density and potential population density. Meaning one of the factors of a good economy is that you have more and more of a population, right? And not only just a bigger population, but a bigger population with a very high standard of living and a high standard of life. And that's a successful society that continues to grow and grow. And it's all determined and based on the values that a culture actually has and wants to preserve in itself. So, for example, if a culture decides to educate and teach its youth stuff like, let's say, Riemann or Gauss or Vernadsky, or understanding the humanities, like reading Dante or reading Schiller, right? Really giving people a sense of what it means to be a human being, and also ways in which they can interpret the physical world around them, not merely just through sensory perception, which is why I brought up Riemann and Gauss and Vernadsky. And you were going to say something?
What is Riemann's Riemann of the Riemann hypothesis, correct? Can you explain that?
What about the Riemann hypothesis?
I'm asking if we're talking about the right intellectual, the right thinker.
Bernard Riemann?
Yes.
What about him?
He's the one who's known for the idea called the Riemann hypothesis. Isn't that right?
What's the Riemann hypothesis? Maybe I've heard of this.
I think it's an idea about number theory. And so I heard it because I'm not familiar with his work, but I was wondering if you knew more about him because you just brought him up.
Well, if you really want to, somebody just brought attention to this paper that Lynn wrote on triple conical curvature action in Riemannian geometry. And it's this idea of actually understanding how the complex domain works in life and in the world. So I think for it to make sense for people who might be watching, there's a paper that Lyndon LaRouche wrote called the Heuristic Manifolds paper, which I will get the full name of it right now. But in terms of organizing and how we actually organize around this, hold on, Heuristic Manifolds paper. Okay, you're making me do a lot of work.
Sorry.
Don't worry about
No.
it. I like it. Heuristic applications of the higher theory of manifolds to the current strategical and subsumed tactical situation. And what I would just tell people is that if they actually want to begin to understand Riemann, because I'm not the expert here to start lecturing people on Riemann, but I did do a lot of work with kids in a summer program where we were looking at non-Euclidean geometry and shapes. This is what Riemann starts to kind of get into. It's stuff like spherics and what happens when you have a donut and how you cut it in half, and the studying the properties of it. It gives you a different way of actually looking at the world and looking at how things are interconnected. And yeah.
Well, I felt that way when I spent a year in Argentina, taking classes at University of Belgrano. And even though the year that I lived there, it was during the year of the pandemic, was that 2020? Yeah, 2020. It was one of the hardest years of my life because I couldn't leave. I couldn't, explore the new country which I'm in. But the University of Belgrano's first year program really focused on that type of classical education. We basically, the classes were structured so you learned Plato at the same time as you're learning about the beginnings to the political theory class and the beginnings of the international relations theory class. And so you can see how ideas that started 2000 years ago have their echoes over time. And you couldn't actually choose classes or like make it your own. So it wasn't as tailored, but I actually really appreciated that because one of the things about American society is that it's like everything has to be tailored just for you. We live in my opinion, a society that has a philosophy that's overly individual centric. So I actually agree with you that we've lost the idea of what it means to be part of the human story, to understand the things that are transcendent, pieces of knowledge just about the universe, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I really like about Vernadsky is the fact that Vernadsky kind of was one of the first people, he wasn't the only person who came up with this conclusion, but was one of the first people to come up with the conclusion that we are an expression of the universe. We are one with the universe, of course, because we're a part of the universe, but we are also the universe thinking about itself,
Hmm.
you know?
Wow. That's
So, yeah, right. Like that's what we are. We are the universe thinking about itself. And it's, so yeah.
I see. I see. Now let's turn the conversation to talk about the politics of your campaign because you are running for office. And one of the things that you focused on a lot is calling for not just a ceasefire in Gaza, but calling to end the genocide, end the occupation, and rebuild Gaza with what you call the Oasis plan, which would require a lot of multinational cooperation, multinational investment. First, even though I think we both agree on this issue, we feel that what's been done to the Palestinian people is absolutely genocidal and unacceptable. The attack they faced on October 7th doesn't justify Israel's response of killing over 40,000 civilians in a completely non-discriminate way. But I wonder, for you, was there a moment when you first came across the issue of Palestinian liberation and it first became important to you?
Um, when it first became important to me, probably, I don't know. I wouldn't say there was one moment. It's one of these things that you get into when you start learning about the truth about, the United States and NATO's role and how, they're an imperialist force nowadays where they're just, putting their boots on countries around the world. And, Israel and Gaza are just one piece of that puzzle. I mean, of course, it's happening in Taiwan as well. It's happening in Ukraine right now, and it's also happening in like 55 other countries.
Hmm.
Um, and it wasn't something that I was like a number one Israel Gaza advocate for. Like I was like that wasn't my number one primary thing because I saw that it is part of a grander scheme of just imperialism and oligarchism, and I
Hmm.
was always trying to take it from the top down approach of, well, you have to dismantle hijacked the forces that have hijacked our government right now, and then you can stop a lot of the genocides happening around the world. And I think if you look at it that way, if you only have this like, I want to stop the genocide in Gaza, um, which is a good view to have, but that's how you get the squad, right? You have the
Hmm.
Ilhan Omars, the AOCs, and Jamal Bowmans that are total cowards and don't actually understand how the military industrial complex system actually works, or the Mickey Mat, as Ray McGovern likes to say. And because they don't actually understand how this works, they think they can just cherry pick which war they want to support and which one they don't. So when they vote to send money to Ukrainian neo-Nazis and they vote to send money to Taiwan, but then they say, no, but we're crossing the line at genocide here in Gaza. I mean, yeah, it's good, but it's all part of
Not
one
logically
thing.
consistent. I
Yeah.
see.
Well, of course not. Yeah, because they're idiots and they think that, you know, the world only revolves around whatever is currently popular at the time. Now, when October 7th happened, I knew very clearly what this was. You know, it was basically, yes, it was Israel's 9/11 because they kept saying this was like 14 9/11s, which is totally, totally like it's just absurd for them to even make that comparison. But it was like 9/11 in the sense that it was allowed to happen. I mean, the United States, you know, presidency allowed 9/11 to happen, you
Right.
know, as a way to institute mass surveillance state and introduce and just completely pour our country into fascism and tyranny.
Right.
And Israel allowed October 7th to happen, so they had pretext to just completely take over and wipe out Palestine and Gaza and annex.
Yes.
That's what this was. And so, you know, when I saw that happen, I said, okay, well, I've got to mobilize to make sure that that doesn't happen. And about 10 days later, you know, in October, it was still a little, it was still kind of like, hey, how can you blame the Israelis for what they're doing because they just lost, you know, X amount of people on October 7th. But I didn't care. You know, on October 17th, I went to Rachel Maddow
Good.
event at Temple Emmanuel, and I stood up and I just said, "Hey, Rachel, I'd rather not listen to your boring book, but you're gonna get Gaza wrong, just like you got Ukraine wrong, just like you got Russiagate wrong." Um, and then I was dragged out, and as I was dragged out, I was saying there's an ethnic cleansing happening in Gaza, and you're just telling lies about it. And so I said that on October 17th, and like that was, you know, well, it was gutsy because it was like trying to tell America 10 days after September 11th, you know, you're the reason why this happened, you know, like you let this happen. It's, you know, so it was, yeah, I mean, yeah, so it's a long way to answer your question, but yeah.
No, that's very thought-provoking for me because actually the way that Lyndon LaRouche describes international empire, like the new ultramontanism, the new across the mountain rule, and it as a system that's against national sovereignty and as a system that's against true even-handed cooperation was really, really fascinating to me. I was almost an international relations major, but I really disliked that subset of political science because it describes human tragedies in sanitized terms, or it describes power imbalances in these very sanitized ways. So, for example, the idea of global hegemony is described by some international relations theorists as liberal hegemony or hegemonic stability theory as a stabilizing force. And I don't think that that's true at all. So there's almost it's almost an inverse picture of the reality that we're really seeing because for some reason, I don't know why, there seems to be sections of a national elite or maybe a borderless sort of global elite that benefits from these conflicts and benefits from keeping people divided. Like, for example, in the Netanyahu case, it's exactly as you said, it was allowed to happen because this gave the pretext for ethnic cleansing to continue against the Palestinians. And prior to that, on the larger scale of things, I know that Israel had funded Hamas and subverted the PLO, which was a more moderate organization that was much more likely to make peace, and actually used Hamas as the designated bad guy, as a not controlled opposition, but as the pretext for for continuing the occupation. And I just wonder, do you have some big picture view of why this is? I mean, is there some ultimate reason that a system that's so inhumane is able to continue like this?
Oh, well, the goal is depopulation, because there are people who have Malthusian beliefs that the world is overpopulated and that the earth has limited resources and is limited in its capacity to actually maintain all these people. And there are people who genuinely believe that the reason why there's poverty is because there's too many people. And this is a myth that has existed since the 1960s. The Club of Rome put out a whole paper called The Limits to Growth.
Hmm.
And when I say Lynn, I mean Lyndon LaRouche. It's just an abbreviated way of saying his name. And Lynn then started the Club of Life. and put out a book called There Are No Limits to Growth.
Hmm.
And you've seen manifestations of this theory kind of peek its head in the ugliest forms of government. I mean, Thomas Ferguson of the State Department, when he was talking about El Salvador in 1979, I think he was quoted as saying this. He was straight up saying, and he was working for an office called the Population Affairs Office. And this was maybe 5 years after Kissinger put out NSSM 200, National something Security Memorandum, National State Security Memorandum 200, which basically outlined this whole plan that we need to depopulate the earth basically, and we have to maintain it under 1.5 billion people or something. This is all public. And so Tom
Wow.
Ferguson of the State Department at the Population Affairs was quoted as saying, look, if countries don't want to play ball with us and, use our methods to, control the population rate, whether it's, birth control, whether it's this or that, or whether it's birth control or whether it's what was it they did in Puerto Rico, they were forcefully sterilizing women and forcefully
Right.
sterilized about a third of the women there. If they don't want to take the safe ways of doing it, then they get what you get in El Salvador. And at the time, El Salvador was going through this nasty civil war, which my dad was drafted into at the age of 16 or 15 years old, forcefully. And so that's what these wars are all about. It's just about depopulation. Bertrand Russell had a theory that, you could just starve people to death, or you could get people sick, and, or people would just end up killing themselves, and that didn't work. So wars were a way to kind of like speed up the process. And there's no greater way to depopulate the earth than a nuclear war, because that's how you wipe out a whole ton of people really quickly. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's all just leading to mass depopulation. That's actually what it is. And there's even more sinisterly, but then I don't know enough. I mean, I've been talking about this with some people about this idea that the counterculture that was started in the 60s is actually what's pervasive today in society. And that when you look at a Blinken and when you look at a Sullivan and these people, they are actually suicidal. And that's what it is to be countercultural. And the United States is acting like the people who killed themselves or wanted to die for one reason or another in the late 60s and early 70s. And the United States is this like mass amalgamation of that process, which is why it's leading itself
Wow.
down this destructive suicidal hole. So
That is very interesting. It's as if, first off, the characterization of the 60s counterculture as a suicidal culture. Can you explain that part more? Because I've never heard, everyone has different views on what the 60s counterculture was about. Some people are very much against it. This will look funny to the viewers because it's like I randomly transported to a different room right in the middle of the podcast episode. But at Transform GSO, where I'm recording this, there was just noise in the other room, so I just paused it and moved. I don't have transportation powers. But my question is, since the that theory you were discussing begins with the premise that the 60s counterculture is a suicidal culture, or it had a suicidal element. I've never quite heard anything like that, because I've heard view people state their opinions that, well, the 60s counterculture was destructive to society. It preached a form of ethics that was way too libertine, way too self-centered, and to what's the word? What's the word for someone that only seeks pleasure? To
hedonistic.
hedonistic, yeah.
Yes.
And but suicidal is a large stretch. And so I wonder,
It's not
here,
actually. It's
yeah,
not. It's actually, that's exactly what it was. I mean, look at the 27 Club and look at the number of people who died in the 1960s, right? Like for example, you had Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, all died at 27 years old, right? There's this culture of decadence where people are becoming addicted to drugs and alcohol, and they're
wow,
suicidal and they're shooting themselves, right? Because that's what it is. I mean, that's what First of all, that's what it is to be addicted to drugs or taking drugs, is to not want to be in reality, is inherently hedonistic and decadent, right? But
Right.
the want to not be in reality and to be under the influence is suicidal, because you, first of all, you're killing your identity and you're actually suppressing your mind and your creative potential. You know, people who say they're more creative when they're under the influence of some substance, well, maybe they would be more creative if they were actually sober and tried to actually make something creative if they weren't under the influence of something. I mean,
Right.
people are so afraid of what they actually are capable of that they have to put some kind of facade over it or some kind of mask on it. And the counterculture, I mean, there's a lot that can be said about the counterculture, and I am not an expert in what it actually was. Because if you actually wanted to start looking at what the counterculture was, the best I can do is give you an introduction into the decadence and suicidal tendencies of it. Look at what's his name from Nirvana. He ended up shooting himself too as a shotgun, right?
Wow.
Kurt Cobain, that's his name.
And a lot of times it's like these people are in really elite institutions. You'd think they would know better. Because one of the questions I wanted to get to discuss in this is, why do people at, often elite universities have such stupid ideas? Why is I guess like, for example, I once went to a talk by the Albright group before I knew who Madeline Albright was, and then I looked at their website, and it was all about getting tax breaks for big corporations in developing countries and like American-led corporations. And then that's when I started to get the sense like, wow, people at elite universities, just because they're considered elite, don't actually have good ideas, or they don't actually have smart ideas. Because to anyone outside that circle, I think it would seem obvious, or at least to me, it seemed obvious. Well, that's a really corrupt thing to do. That's a really corrupt business to operate. And yet, it's often people who are most within the circle, or most within, highest up in the spheres of influence in society, who have the worst ideas. I mean, do you see that in New York? I'm sure.
I mean, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, but the problem is because the population is stupid. That's why. I mean, you have people who go on podcasts who like say the most simple things, and it's seen as like the profound, deep thought. I was talking about this with a friend of mine yesterday about this guy, Eric Weinstein. Do you know who he is?
Somewhat.
And then he's like asked about all kinds of things about psychology, and then he's asked about music, and then he grabs a guitar and he starts playing a C major scale backwards. You know what a C major scale is, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do.
Yeah.
And then he starts playing it backwards, or it's like do, re, do, mi, sol, fa, la, whatever. And he says, this is actually the beginning of joy to the world. Joy to the world, the Lord has. That's just,
It's just a basic scale.
yeah, but it's just a basic scale backwards, and people think this is some like profound shit. Like, oh my God, wow, I never knew that. It's like, and I think the problem is just that the population has just been so dumbed down that we let them get away with it, and we see this thing as like elite, but the responsibility is on us to kind of call it out and just say, hey, this is, I mean, that's why I interrupted events. That's why I interrupted at the Asian Society recently.
Mhm.
That video now has like hundreds of millions of views, and it's been like all over China. And I went after Matt Pottinger, and this guy's just talking about how, well, China is very antagonistic in Taiwan, and we should defend Taiwan, and we should continue our strategy of defense, ambiguity, strategic ambiguity. I'm like, come on, and really, I'm supposed to believe that
Yeah.
China is the threat to World War III right now? Like,
The US is the ultramontane power, or the one that's the most threatening, because we're the ones who have our military bases right up close to Russia, right up close to every conflict zone. And so it's as if the US, from what I've seen watching the news, portrays itself as the savior for conflicts that it helps precipitate. I mean, this was true for our intervention in Afghanistan. We funded the Taliban as a counterweight to the Soviets because we viewed it as necessary. The conventional wisdom is that if the US doesn't allow Ukraine into NATO, then Russia is going to take Ukraine's sovereignty. But it was the very fact that we pushed for Ukraine joining NATO that prompted the fears that it threatens Russia's sovereignty in the first place. Because it's not that Ukraine is a sovereign country. I mean, we did a coup in 2014. And so to do the coup in the country that close to Russia with that type of ties to Russia, I think that threatens Russia's sovereignty. I don't think the war that's displaced people is the justified response or the right response, but that's the U.S. portraying itself as the savior for the conflicts it precipitates, you know? So, I was saying you've spoken a lot about the truth of what's happening in international affairs, about the U.S. being the aggressor. And I think I saw the clip you're referring to. But when does it actually land? When is it actually able to be taken as a message that is truthful and that is worthy to be analyzed and taken apart more? Or do people find ways to just ignore it and say, well, this is just his opinion or just the opinions of a candidate, someone running for office? How do you get that message to be taken seriously is my question.
By just, well, first of all, just by doing what I did. I mean, for one, you look at the effect that these videos have, and every person you intervene on is different, and it should be different. But they do have effects. Sometimes they're unseen effects, and this goes back to our Riemann discussion, about how discrete manifolds work and how sometimes, things that you don't see are the most important things that happen. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion that not super prepped for right now. But um, uh, you have to I mean, look at it this way. When I confronted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2022, that period between October to November, the election day, there were so many interventions going on. People were sending me their stuff. They're like, here, edit this, make this look good. I was giving people advice on how to do it and stuff. And that created this sort of tension in that sort of created a tension in the environment that forced the progressive caucus of the wing of the Democratic Party in the Congress to put out a statement asking Biden to exercise some more diplomacy when it comes to dealing with Ukraine and Russia. And I was like, no way. All right.
Wow.
Awesome. And then they didn't even last 24 hours. They had to resend the statement, and they were told, no. They were told that it
But even if they don't give you credit, then they take account of the public pressure that builds up and kind of in an underhanded way.
yeah, it shouldn't be about, it should not be about credit. It should not be
Yeah.
about credit. It's, in fact, when I first confronted Kamala Harris in 2021, a lot of people didn't know who I was, and I was okay with that. I mean, this was still the era where you had to wear masks to be in public events. So, it was fine with me, and I just, things I said stood true, and people at the New York Post wrote articles saying I agreed with the guy who stood up and said something, and a lot of the times you're echoing the things that people already actually believe. If 434 other people stood up the way I have at the Asia Society, you'd actually have a presidency. You would actually have a functioning government. You would have people who actually give a shit, because that's what government is, actually. Government is when people actually stand up and they decide that they want to take responsibility and accountability for the things that are going on in the country. And that doesn't mean they have to be elected to do that. That just means they're citizens, because at the end of the day, they're the first branch of government.
I see. I want to pivot the conversation to talking about economics and inequality now. The Bronx is, by most measures, one of the poorest, or if not the poorest district in the country. And a major theme of your campaign is running as a Bronx warrior and running to restore hope to the Bronx. I wonder, how do you bring this message at a time when the country is so divided, at a time when people might think, just for the sake of argument, that, why should I even help the Bronx? Maybe I only need to help my own region. Is that a theme that you've encountered or a type of opposition that you've encountered, thinking that each district's own or each region's own ideas are more important than helping pull forward the poorest districts?
Yeah, I have encountered it, and it's bullshit. And I normally encounter it from people who are outside the district, funny enough. You know why? Maybe
Wow.
it's just the Bronx, but I'm in the Bronx. I'm in the streets of the Bronx, and the people know exactly what the fuck is going on. And that's why they're inherently distrustful of me, because they say, well, how do I know you're not going to be like one of them? And they
Hmm.
should have that attitude, you know, they should exactly tell me that shit, because it's my job to prove to them that, one, I'm worth voting for, but more importantly, it's also my job to convince them that, you know, change doesn't begin at the ballot box, or it doesn't begin at the voting booth. It begins right there in their mind when they decide to declare their independence and say, be free of all this bullshit that keeps you behind, where people are telling you the only thing you should worry about is where you're going to get your next meal, and you leave the stuff about war and stuff to the people who actually care. The reason why a lot of people are going to have to worry about their next meal is because we send all this money to other countries and we don't develop our own country. We, you know, a lot of our old family farms have been overtaken by this factory farming bullshit, and it's all this speculative all the speculation on grocery goods has just risen artificially the prices of groceries. It's
Right.
not that we have a lack of food. We're
Right.
throwing jugs of milk out. We're throwing eggs out because there's too much of it. You know, it's just speculative things that make these things cost. The reason why everything is so bad in the United States in these neighborhoods is because the entire orientation of the country is what's wrong and leading us to falling off the edge of a cliff and imploding. You cannot fix things neighborhood by neighborhood. It just won't work. Even here in the poorest congressional district of the country, all right, you can't just turn it around and ignore the rest of the country, because it has to be a nationwide effort to actually fix neighborhoods in the Bronx, in the country, not just in the Bronx. That doesn't mean I don't have plans to develop the Bronx. Of course I do, given the fact that I'd be a congressman representing this
Right.
area. We're going to turn the Bronx into the envy of the world, where anybody who wants to learn advanced aeronautic engineering or advanced infrastructure engineering or civil engineering can
Wow.
come here and learn it. That's what we're going to do. And the Bronx will lead the way for the country, because it already does. All right. The way in which the way in which the Bronx is messed up right now is the way that the entire country is headed to. Okay, that's what I mean by the Bronx is going to lead the way. So if the Bronx becomes a science center, okay, where a bunch of young people can come and learn and develop their minds and skills, then the country will become that. And that's how you're going to fix not just the Bronx, but the country as a whole. So no, I don't get caught up in this localistic bullshit, but your constituents only think about food. No. First of
Mm.
all, that's a lot of racism. Okay. Secondly, that's a lot of people who are out of touch with people who are on the streets. That's internet brain. Get out of the internet and go talk to people in the streets. I got 12,000 signatures and Diane got 70,000 signatures because we ran on a pro-peace platform, okay? And we got those in 6 weeks. We spoke with thousands of people every day, and they are all saying the same thing. Yeah, it's bullshit. We send money to these wars when we don't have any for ourselves.
Mm.
It's not more complicated than that.
I see. One of the issues that I've spoken about with people is the amount of tax dollars that go not to public services, but to repaying the debt. And historically, countries have really struggled to develop when they have large deficits at the same time. Do you have a plan for challenging the US deficit, or does this issue have to be sort of pushed to the side because of more pressing concerns, like the concerns, immediate concerns with food and immediate concerns with well-being?
Wait, could you repeat that exactly? What was
Yeah.
that?
So historically, from my studies of the subject, countries have really struggled to develop their economies and to move forward when they have a large deficit. And the problem with the US now, that I've spoken to with many people running for office who want to change things, is that more of the deficit, more of our tax dollars now go to repaying the deficit. And that's another reason why we can't invest in infrastructure and can't invest in food and can't invest in bettering the country, is because we have higher taxes, but it's just going to pay back debts that we incurred in the past. Does this issue have to be addressed, or is deficit hawking like kind of like a trap?
You need to throw out your entire books of economics is what people need to do, and leave me alone with
Okay, we'll explain. Well,
like
let's
this.
hear
They
it.
have this whole libertarian bullshit about how taxes are the death of us and that we're just paying off our deficits. Look, in a real Hamiltonian economy that actually built the country, you'll have debt. Okay, and debt is a good thing if it's used for the things that are needed to be used for exactly. So if we're spending $1 trillion and building F-16 fighter jets that are just going to be used in Gaza to blow bits, children, yeah, good luck trying to pay that shit back. But if you're spending, and just the fact that it's like immoral to do, but if you're spending $1 trillion in debt, you're taking out money from a national bank and you're printing $1 trillion, but you're using it to build a high-speed rail around the country and rebuild a lot of the housing that's collapsed and rebuild up nuclear power plants and invest the money into fusion. You will have a return on investment, but it's not going to be in monetary terms. It's going to be in development terms because that's what ultimately matters. Like, oh, we have $1 trillion debt. Okay, well, it'll be paid back, not immediately, of course, but if you put that money towards fusion and you invent this new power, which is almost limitless power of fusion, then energy is just going to be so cheap that it'll be more expensive to send you a bill. Okay, it'll be more expensive to use the postal service than to power your home if we actually have fusion energy.
Wow.
The Chinese are on the verge of developing nuclear fusion. In fact, we've already created nuclear fusion machines that can output more energy than they input. So then the question is going to be, well, then how are we going to actually power the fusion machines, right? Well, people say helium, okay. But on the moon, there's a special form of helium called helium-3, which is made up of 2 protons and 1 neutron, as opposed to 2 protons and 2 neutrons. So when you actually have a fusion reaction, the neutrons don't shoot off the extra neutron, thus causing nuclear waste. It's all used up. So you would have a nuclear fusion machine with no nuclear waste. And helium-3 is mostly found on the moon, but that's okay because we know people who've already developed ways to mine helium-3 on the moon. So the question is, how do we develop technologies that's going to be able to go to the moon, mine shit, and come back? Well, the technologies that we develop to do that will benefit the world and benefit humanity. In what ways? I don't know. Just like in the way in which the Apollo space program allowed for there to be developments for mankind and humanity and creativity, is exactly the same way in which it benefited us. For example, you just have super basic questions. There's an astronaut in space. What happens if he has a heart attack? Who the hell's going to revive him? Pacemaker. Boom. That's how a pacemaker was invented, because people were like, well, maybe there should be some machine in there that if his heart stops, it should boom. Or insulation and fireproofing homes and apartment buildings. What happens if there's a fire in the space shuttle in one part and we want to contain it? Oh, hey, well, let's develop a new material that is fire resistant or can spread. There's the reason why we have cell phones today is because of the space program. You need to have a reason to develop things. You need to have a reason to develop new technological advancements, and the space program is one of the ways to do it. So, economics is not about money or deficits or taxes. Even economics is about development. That's the whole truth of it. That's the actual skinny. The money is just a vehicle to make things happen. So it just matters how you're actually using money.
I see. The last question I want to ask is, me and Matt looked at your website and we didn't see if you take, and this we might be incorrect, but we didn't see if you took a stance on the gun control debate. And so my question is, do you agree more with people who say that there need to be stricter gun regulations for public safety? Or do you agree more with people who believe that this is an infringement that crosses a red? Ooh.
I am pro Second Amendment. I mean, it's there for a reason. I believe in the Second Amendment. I don't think guns are necessarily the problem of what's I mean, yes, they physically do kill people and are the reason why a lot of people die in these school shootings. And should the access be restricted to them? Sure, of course. I mean, I think the fact that anybody can walk in many states and just buy a gun, sometimes with just filling out a little piece of paper that says, "Do you promise you're not crazy?" is absurd. Sure. Maybe there can be a few more regulations that make common sense. But ultimately, the reason why you have violent attacks and outbursts is not because people have access to guns. The reason is because you have a decadent culture, which goes back to my whole counterculture thing. I mean, what is the point of living? Okay, because people who commit school shootings come to the conclusion that living is an absurdity. Okay, that the world is so fucked up that living is hell. And sometimes they may even think that, you know what, I'm gonna go shoot up this elementary. I'm just quoting a
Yeah,
hypothetical scenario. I don't
understood.
want
Yeah.
somebody to take this out of context and say, like somebody might think that shooting up a school is doing a mercy killing on children because I'm going to spare them of living this horrible life, right? Because they think that life is not worth living. You'll notice that there haven't been a lot of school shootings reported lately. You know why? Because a lot of young people right now care about what's going on in Gaza and Palestine and have
Hmm.
a reason to say, well, wait a minute, I got to focus and fight my energy to make sure that people don't die. Okay. Because they see that there's an absurdity happening right now. Young people and teenagers have a reason not to kill each other for once and say, shit, no, we got to stand up against the evil empire and do something. That's why you're having these school walkouts. That's why you're having people stand up. That's why you have the encampments in colleges, because people are actually,
Hmm.
it's you know, yeah, things are really bad. Things are worse than bad. Things are never as bad as you think they are. They're worse, but people at least have some kind of drive or grit to say, well, shit, I got to fight for something, and I got to make sure people stop dying across the world. And that's giving people a purpose again to not be suicidal and depressed and hung up on whoever broke their heart last time, but actually like, do something.
Yeah. It's the opposite of maybe um that reminds me of something that Norman Finkelstein said on an interview that really resonated with me because he said in the midst of the student loan crisis, soaring inflation, a mental health crisis, environmental issues, the young people have seized on Gaza, a powerless, stateless people across the ocean and have turned out and spoken in favor of Gaza. And at the beginning of the situation, I was going to my city council meetings to speak out every single time. And it's very disappointing to me that they signaled at first that they were going to pass a ceasefire resolution, but then ended up not passing a resolution and kind of brushing us off. But the way I see that too, the way the community came together, it broke down cultural barriers. It took away attention from what I think is the culture war because standing for Gaza is much, much more significant than any of that. And it's incredible that this is the I think the issue that's reigniting faith for people to get past things. I think you're right on that. Um, my other question is that goes with that is given how do you make that last? I mean, how do you make it so that it's not just one moment? Because even though um well, I've heard people compare the student protests for Gaza, to the Vietnam protests. And one of the comparisons was that the Vietnam protests were sort of self-interested because it was often middle-class people who didn't want to go fight in the war themselves. And that's part of the reason. But the Gaza protests, I don't think you can call that self-interested at all. And so does that give you hope that the movement for Gaza will be something really long-lasting, like a political force to be reckoned with in the US? Because on one hand, I think it could die out. On the other hand, I think it could be a very lasting movement.
Well, on Vietnam, the problem was it was also wrapped up in the counterculture too, which
Mhm.
is
I
kind of
see.
why it was naturally going to die down. I mean, yeah, a large part of it was because people were seeing their friends get drafted, or they could have been drafted, or
Hmm.
so it's like people had to mobilize. And if there was a draft today for a war, the war would be over in 5 days, because whoever's getting that draft card, whether they get the draft letter or not, they're going to go mobilize against this war, okay? Because nobody's going to go fight for the United States anymore after this. As to whether or not this movement and energy will actually continue to last, well, you have to ask yourself, a lot of the people who protested Vietnam were out there supporting Ukraine in this war, might even be supporting Israel in this war, because at some point they sold out. And the
Right.
problem, because you didn't have a culture that actually, was able to nurture and sustain that energy of people who wanted to do something great and focus their energies on problem solving into something creative. And I think the way in which you keep this going is you have to then shift away the issues to, okay, great. Well, now there's people with energy poverty, people who have to turn their lights off at 7 o'clock because they don't have enough energy. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of food scarcity. You know, there's the fact that we need high-speed rail. There's the fact that we have to make sure that we need X amount of schools built. You know, people can shift their energy, which they can, because you have to make it so that people want to do these things. And they need to understand that the reason why you have war is because you don't have the development in the country. And if they actually want to stop all wars in the future, is that you need development. And so I think, you know, getting people to shift to this idea that development is the key forward, and that people, you know, can shift their energy from stopping a genocide in Gaza, which will hopefully happen soon, to now how do we get man back on the moon and build a permanent moon base up there so that we can continue to develop the country. That I think is a another thing, but ultimately it's about explaining to people that the battle is never really over. You know, we have to kill evil at its root. We have to actually make sure that, you know, because the problem is a lot of people do have short attention spans, and that's okay. The reason why the world has changed for the better has always been because the work of a small dedicated minority of people who decide they want to make the world better place. The American Revolution happened with 33% of people who were in support of independence, 33% of people who did not care, and 33% of people who said we should stay with the British.
Hmm.
You don't need a majority to actually get things done in the world. You just need people who are dedicated, who want to get the world to be a better place. So, yeah.
Jose, those are all the questions I have for tonight. Thank you for coming on Philosophisn't. I really appreciate it. And I wish you the best of luck in your campaign.
Great. Thank you, man.
So
I
the editing will
appreciate
take at most 5 days. At best, it'll be a 2-day turnaround. We had to sort of reorganize our team and change who does what task. And we were just today, I was just meeting with part of most of the team to discuss that beforehand. That's why I'm here downtown. But thank you. Send
Yeah,
me
man.
the
Will
course.
do.
All right.
Nice meeting you, man.
Nice meeting you. And I'll keep going to the conference calls Friday too.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Yeah, please do.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Take care.